Marcus William Sterling commanded fear and respect in equal measure from the 52nd floor of his Manhattan tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city he had conquered through 3 decades of ruthless business dealings. At 56, Sterling had built Apex Corporation into a $100 billion empire through acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and strategic destruction of competitors who dared to challenge his dominance in technology, real estate, and finance. Wall Street had given Sterling the nickname the Glacier for his ability to remain emotionally detached while destroying the livelihoods of thousands of employees during corporate restructuring. His reputation for cold calculation and merciless efficiency had made him one of the most feared executives in American business, someone whose mere interest in a company could cause stock prices to fluctuate and board members to panic. Sterling's office reflected his personality, stark, intimidating, and designed to make visitors feel small and vulnerable. The massive desk, imported Italian marble floors, and carefully curated art collection worth millions served as props in the theater of power that Sterling orchestrated during every business meeting. Even seasoned CEOs and government officials often left his office feeling as though they had been psychologically dissected by a master predator. The path to Sterling's current dominance had been paved with the wreckage of smaller companies, terminated employees, and broken promises that he considered necessary casualties in the pursuit of maximum profit. His business philosophy rejected sentiment, loyalty, and compassion as weaknesses that successful leaders couldn't afford to indulge, especially in the hyper-competitive world of global capitalism, where only the strongest survived. Sterling's personal life reflected the same cold efficiency that characterized his business operations. He lived alone in a penthouse that was more museum than home, maintained relationships that were strategic rather than emotional, and avoided any situation that might require genuine human connection or vulnerability. The fortress of wealth and power that he had constructed around himself served as both protection and prison, isolating him from the messy complications of authentic human relationships. However, Sterling's carefully controlled world was about to be shattered by an encounter that would force him to confront a past he had spent decades trying to forget, and a connection that his money and power couldn't eliminate or control. Sterling's daily routine included a precisely timed walk through Central Park, a ritual that served multiple purposes: physical exercise, mental preparation for the day's business challenges, and a public display of confidence that reinforced his image as someone who moved through the world without fear or concern for ordinary security risks. The walk followed the same route each morning, protected by discreet security personnel who maintained careful distance while ensuring their clients' safety. The October morning when Sterling's life would change forever began like thousands of others, with his driver depositing him at the park's entrance precisely at 6:30 a.m. for a 40-minute walk that would conclude at his office building. Sterling walked alone as he preferred, using the time to review mental notes about upcoming meetings, strategic decisions, and the various corporate battles that required his personal attention. Sterling's attitude toward the homeless individuals who populated certain areas of Central Park reflected his broader worldview. They were unfortunate but irrelevant, problems for social services rather than successful business people, invisible reminders of failure that he acknowledged only when their presence interfered with his personal comfort or convenience. His wealth had insulated him from understanding or caring about the circumstances that led to homelessness, and his security team ensured that he was never directly approached by people seeking assistance. The homeless encampment near the park's northern section had existed for several years, tolerated by authorities who lacked resources for more permanent solutions, and ignored by most park visitors who found it easier to pretend such problems didn't exist. Sterling had walked past this area hundreds of times without giving it serious thought, viewing it as an unfortunate but unavoidable aspect of urban life that had no relevance to his world of corporate power and financial success. However, something was different about this particular morning. As Sterling approached the area where several homeless individuals had set up temporary shelters, one figure separated herself from the group and began walking directly toward him, with a purpose and confidence that immediately triggered his security team's alert protocols. The woman appeared to be in her early 50s, wearing layers of worn clothing that suggested long-term homelessness, but moving with a determination that seemed inconsistent with the mental illness or substance abuse that Sterling assumed characterized most homeless individuals. Her direct approach and unwavering eye contact created a situation that Sterling's security training had taught him to recognize as potentially dangerous. Sterling's security team moved to intercept the approaching woman, but something about her demeanor caused Sterling to hesitate before allowing them to physically remove her from his vicinity. Despite her obvious poverty and the layers of worn clothing that marked her as homeless, the woman carried herself with a dignity and purpose that seemed familiar in a way that Sterling couldn't immediately identify. As the woman drew closer, Sterling found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him. Beneath the weathering and premature aging that came from years of life on the streets, her features seemed to trigger memories that he had buried so deeply that they felt more like dreams than actual experiences. Her eyes, in particular, held an intelligence and warmth that seemed inconsistent with Sterling's assumptions about homeless individuals. The woman stopped just outside the perimeter that Sterling's security team had established, close enough to speak, but not so close as to trigger immediate physical intervention. Her posture was respectful but not subservient, suggesting someone who understood power dynamics but wasn't intimidated by Sterling's obvious wealth and the protective barrier of his security personnel. When the woman spoke, her voice carried an accent and cadence that sent shockwaves through Sterling's carefully controlled emotional defenses. The tone was unmistakably from the South, specifically from the rural Georgia community where Sterling had spent the first 12 years of his life, before his family's financial circumstances had dramatically improved and relocated them to New York. Sterling had spent decades eliminating all traces of his humble origins, hiring voice coaches to remove his accent, creating a personal history that began with prep school rather than public school, and ensuring that no business associates could trace his background to the poverty and dysfunction that had characterized his early childhood. The success of this reinvention had been so complete that Sterling sometimes forgot his own origins. However, hearing that familiar accent in the sophisticated urban environment of Central Park created cognitive dissonance that temporarily paralyzed Sterling's usual ability to process and respond to unexpected situations. The woman's voice carried emotional resonance that penetrated decades of psychological barriers and reached something in Sterling that he had thought was permanently buried. The moment stretched between them, with Sterling's security team waiting for instructions while the woman studied his face with an expression that suggested recognition and perhaps disappointment at what he had become. When the woman leaned forward and spoke again, her voice was barely audible, but carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. The single word she whispered contained power that Sterling's billions couldn't protect him from, carrying with it the weight of memories, relationships, and experiences that he had spent his adult life trying to escape and forget. Bubba. The childhood nickname hit Sterling like a physical blow, stopping his breathing and freezing his entire body in a moment of recognition that shattered 30 years of carefully constructed persona. Only one person had ever called him Bubba, and that person was supposed to be dead, buried in the poverty and chaos of his Georgia childhood, along with all the other painful memories that successful people weren't supposed to carry. Sterling's mind raced through possibilities and explanations while his body remained paralyzed by shock and recognition. The homeless woman standing before him couldn't be who his subconscious was telling him she was, because that person had disappeared from his life when he was 12 years old, when his family had suddenly acquired wealth and moved north, leaving behind everyone and everything connected to their previous circumstances. The woman's face, now that Sterling was looking at it with recognition, rather than dismissive assumptions, showed traces of the girl who had been his closest friend, his protector, and his emotional anchor during the most difficult years of his childhood. Beneath the weathering and aging that came from decades of hard living, he could see the features of someone who had once been the most important person in his world. "Emma?" Sterling's voice was barely a whisper, carrying a vulnerability that he hadn't allowed himself to feel since childhood. The confirmation in Emma's eyes created a rush of memories and emotions that threatened to overwhelm Sterling's carefully maintained psychological equilibrium. Images flooded his consciousness, shared meals of whatever food they could find, nights when Emma had protected him from neighborhood bullies, dreams they had shared about escaping their circumstances and building better lives together. Sterling's security team had never seen their client display vulnerability or uncertainty, and Emma's effect on him created a situation that their training hadn't prepared them to handle. The most powerful man they had ever protected was standing frozen in apparent recognition of a homeless woman, whose presence seemed to have temporarily stripped away all of his armor and authority. The flood of memories triggered by Emma's presence transported Sterling back to a time when he had been Billy Sterling, a scrawny kid living in a trailer park outside Macon, Georgia, where poverty was a shared experience, and survival often depended on the kindness of neighbors who had little to spare. Emma Johnson had lived 3 trailers down, and despite being only a year older, she had appointed herself as Billy's protector and guide through the complexities of childhood, in an environment where adults were often too overwhelmed by their own problems to provide adequate supervision or care. Emma had been the kind of child who seemed naturally wise beyond her years, possessing an intuitive understanding of people and situations that allowed her to navigate the social dynamics of their community with remarkable skill. She had shared whatever food her family could spare, helped Billy with homework when his parents were too busy or drunk to provide assistance, and created adventures and games that made their harsh circumstances feel temporarily magical. The friendship between Billy and Emma had been the anchor that kept Sterling grounded during years when his family's dysfunction threatened to destroy his sense of self-worth and future possibilities. Emma's unwavering belief in his intelligence and potential had provided him with the confidence necessary to excel academically, and her protection had shielded him from bullies who might otherwise have made his school experience miserable. When Sterling's father had suddenly struck it rich through a combination of lottery winnings and a successful lawsuit, the family's rapid elevation from poverty to wealth had created opportunities that 12-year-old Billy had dreamed about, but hadn't known how to navigate. The move to New York, enrollment in exclusive private schools, and immersion in upper-class society had required abandoning not just their geographic location, but their entire social identity. Sterling's parents had made it clear that maintaining connections to their previous life would interfere with their family's social advancement, and young Billy had been forced to choose between his past and his future. The decision to cut all ties with Georgia, including his friendship with Emma, had been presented as temporary but had gradually become permanent as Sterling discovered that his new life required complete reinvention. The guilt and regret associated with abandoning Emma had been buried beneath decades of business success and personal achievement, but seeing her now brought back the full emotional impact of a choice that had haunted Sterling more than any corporate decision he had ever made. Standing in Central Park, faced with the physical presence of the friend he had abandoned, Sterling was forced to confront the true cost of his transformation from Billy to Marcus Sterling. The success that he had achieved, the respect that he commanded, and the power that he wielded had all been built on a foundation that required rejecting his origins and the people who had shaped his early development. Emma's appearance served as a living reminder of the path not taken, the relationship sacrificed, and the authenticity abandoned in pursuit of social and financial advancement. Sterling's carefully constructed identity as a self-made billionaire was revealed as partially fraudulent, built on denying rather than transcending his humble beginnings. The contrast between Sterling's current circumstances and Emma's obvious poverty created a moral reckoning that Sterling's business philosophy had trained him to avoid. His success had been achieved through exactly the kind of ruthless efficiency that allowed some people to thrive while others fell through society's cracks, and Emma's presence forced him to acknowledge the human cost of the system that had elevated him. Sterling's security team remained alert, but confused by their client's obvious emotional distress and his failure to either engage with or dismiss the homeless woman who had triggered this unprecedented display of vulnerability. Their training had prepared them for physical threats, business rivals, and various forms of corporate espionage, but not for encounters with figures from Sterling's hidden past. Emma waited patiently while Sterling processed the implications of their reunion, her expression showing a mixture of sadness, understanding, and perhaps hope that the boy she had known and protected still existed somewhere beneath the layers of wealth and power that had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of separation, regret, and the weight of choices that had led them to such dramatically different circumstances. Sterling realized that Emma's presence represented more than just an unexpected encounter. It was an opportunity for redemption, or a final confirmation that his transformation had been so complete that the authentic person he had once been was irretrievably lost. The moment required Sterling to choose between maintaining the emotional walls that protected his carefully constructed identity, or allowing himself to reconnect with the most genuine relationship he had ever experienced, knowing that either choice would fundamentally alter his understanding of himself and his priorities. As Sterling struggled to process Emma's presence and what it meant for his carefully controlled life, Emma began speaking in the same gentle voice that had comforted him through countless childhood crises. Her words revealed a story that Sterling had never heard, filling in the decades of separation with experiences that challenged his assumptions about success, failure, and the factors that determined people's life outcomes. Emma explained that after Sterling's family had left Georgia, she had continued excelling academically and had earned a full scholarship to the University of Georgia, where she had studied social work with dreams of helping other children navigate the kinds of challenges they had faced together. Her academic success and natural empathy had seemed to guarantee a future of meaningful work and stable middle-class life. However, Emma's promising trajectory had been derailed by a series of circumstances that demonstrated how quickly life could change for people without the safety nets that wealth provided. A car accident during her junior year had resulted in serious injuries and medical bills that exceeded her insurance coverage, forcing her to drop out of school and take low-paying jobs to manage her debt and support her family. The economic recession of the early 2000s had eliminated many of the social service positions that Emma's education had prepared her for, and a series of family emergencies had prevented her from returning to school or building the kind of stable career that might have provided financial security. Mental health challenges, exacerbated by stress and trauma, had made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain employment or housing. Emma's descent into homelessness had been gradual rather than sudden, the result of multiple small crises that individually seemed manageable, but collectively created insurmountable challenges. The social safety net that was supposed to catch people like Emma had proven inadequate for someone whose problems were complex and who lacked the personal connections or family resources that might have provided support during difficult periods. Despite her circumstances, Emma had continued working with other homeless individuals, using her education and natural empathy to help people navigate social services, find temporary employment, and maintain dignity in situations that were designed to be dehumanizing. Her unofficial role as advocate and counselor had earned her respect within the homeless community and occasional recognition from social service agencies. Emma's story revealed the arbitrary nature of success and failure, demonstrating how circumstances beyond individual control could determine life outcomes regardless of intelligence, education, or moral character. Emma's story forced Sterling to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, opportunity, and the role that luck had played in his own success. While he had spent decades believing that his achievements resulted from superior intelligence and work ethic, Emma's example demonstrated that equally intelligent and hardworking people could experience dramatically different outcomes based on circumstances beyond their control. The realization that Emma had possessed the same potential for success that Sterling had achieved challenged his fundamental beliefs about meritocracy and social mobility. Her academic accomplishments and continued dedication to helping others despite her own struggles revealed character strengths that Sterling had to acknowledge were superior to his own commitment to ruthless self-advancement. Sterling's emotional response to Emma's story was complicated by guilt, regret, and the recognition that his abandonment of their friendship had been motivated by shame about his origins, rather than practical necessity. The boy who had once depended on Emma's protection and support had grown into a man who actively participated in the kind of economic system that had failed her so completely. The contrast between Emma's continued compassion and Sterling's cultivation of emotional detachment highlighted the different paths their lives had taken, and the different values that had shaped their choices. Emma had remained connected to her authentic self and her commitment to helping others, while Sterling had systematically eliminated emotional connections that might interfere with business success. Sterling's security team watched nervously as their client displayed unprecedented vulnerability and emotional engagement with someone they had been trained to view as a potential threat. The homeless woman's obvious effect on Sterling created a situation that challenged their professional protocols and raised questions about their client's psychological state and decision-making capacity. Emma waited patiently for Sterling's response to her story, her expression showing hope that the boy she had known and loved still existed somewhere beneath the layers of wealth and power that had transformed him. Her presence offered Sterling an opportunity for redemption and reconnection with his authentic self, but accepting that opportunity would require acknowledging the moral compromises that had built his empire. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities that could fundamentally alter Sterling's understanding of himself, his priorities, and his responsibilities to the people whose lives his business decisions affected. Sterling's response to Emma's presence and story would define not only the remainder of their encounter, but potentially the direction of his life and the legacy he would leave behind. The choice he faced was more complex than simply helping an old friend. It was about whether to continue the path of emotional isolation that had built his business empire, or to reconnect with the compassion and authenticity that Emma represented. The practical considerations were overwhelming. Sterling's business empire required constant attention, ruthless decision-making, and emotional detachment that had proven incompatible with personal relationships or social responsibility. Reconnecting with Emma would inevitably lead to questions about his priorities, his business practices, and his commitment to the kind of success that required treating people as expendable resources. However, the emotional impact of seeing Emma and hearing her story had awakened something in Sterling that he had thought was permanently buried. The boy who had depended on her kindness and protection was demanding acknowledgement and suggesting that the man he had become was a betrayal of everything she had taught him about human connection and moral responsibility. Sterling's first decision was immediate and instinctive. He instructed his security team to step back and give him privacy for a conversation that couldn't be conducted under their watchful protection. The gesture demonstrated trust that Sterling hadn't shown toward another human being in decades and represented the first crack in the armor that had protected him from emotional vulnerability. The conversation that followed was halting and awkward as Sterling struggled to bridge the gap between the person he had become and the boy Emma remembered. His apologies for abandoning their friendship felt inadequate given the decades of separation and the dramatic differences in their circumstances, but Emma's response showed the same gracious understanding that had characterized their childhood relationship. Emma's forgiveness and continued affection for the boy she had known gave Sterling permission to explore the possibility of reconnection without the judgment and condemnation that he felt he deserved. Her presence offered him something that his wealth couldn't purchase: unconditional acceptance and the opportunity to rediscover parts of himself that business success had required him to eliminate. Sterling's offer to help Emma with housing, medical care, and other immediate needs was accepted graciously, but with conditions that challenged his assumptions about charity and social responsibility. Emma's requirements for assistance included Sterling's personal involvement in understanding and addressing the broader issues that affected homeless individuals, rather than simply writing checks to assuage his guilt. The encounter with Emma initiated a transformation in Sterling that affected every aspect of his life, from his business practices to his personal relationships to his understanding of success and social responsibility. The process was gradual and sometimes painful, as Sterling discovered that reconnecting with his authentic self required acknowledging and correcting decades of moral compromises and emotional isolation. Sterling's first major change involved restructuring his business practices to prioritize employee welfare, community impact, and social responsibility alongside traditional profit metrics. The transition was challenging and expensive, requiring Sterling to abandon some of the ruthless efficiency that had built his empire, but it also created opportunities for innovation and leadership that he had never explored. Emma's integration into Sterling's life as advisor, friend, and moral compass provided him with perspectives and insights that improved both his personal happiness and his business effectiveness. Her experience with social services, homeless advocacy, and community organizing offered Sterling practical knowledge about social problems that his wealth had previously insulated him from understanding. The media attention that followed Sterling's dramatic change in business philosophy and personal priorities created both opportunities and challenges for his corporate empire. While some investors and business partners questioned his commitment to maximum profitability, others were attracted to his evolving reputation as a leader who balanced financial success with social responsibility. Sterling's relationship with Emma evolved from guilt-driven charity to genuine partnership in addressing the systemic issues that had contributed to her homelessness and affected millions of other Americans. Their collaboration on housing initiatives, job training programs, and healthcare access demonstrated the potential for business resources to create sustainable solutions to social problems. The personal satisfaction that Sterling derived from his evolving relationship with Emma and his growing involvement in social justice causes provided him with fulfillment that his previous achievements had never delivered. The emotional connection and sense of purpose that characterized his new life contrasted sharply with the isolation and emptiness that had defined his years of pure business focus. Sterling's transformation also included reconnecting with other aspects of his authentic identity that business success had required him to suppress, including his Southern heritage, his appreciation for community relationships, and his capacity for empathy and emotional vulnerability that had been essential parts of his childhood personality. The legacy that Sterling began building through his partnership with Emma and his commitment to social responsibility offered the possibility of redemption for decades of choices that had prioritized personal advancement over human connection and moral responsibility. His story became an example of how authentic transformation was possible, even for people who had traveled far from their original values and relationships. Emma's role in Sterling's transformation demonstrated the power of authentic friendship and moral courage to create change in even the most hardened individuals, proving that the connections formed in childhood could survive decades of separation and fundamental differences in circumstances to provide opportunities for redemption and renewal.